Good morning, everyone. We are very pleased to welcome Dr. Robin Buckley today, who has earned her PhD in clinical psychology from Hofstra University, with specialized training in cognitive behavioral methodology and executive coaching. Her work as an expert in the field has been featured on multiple media platforms, including Entrepreneur, Chief, Authority Magazine, Nike, and on the TED stage. As an international speaker, Robin focuses on the application of cognitive behavioral strategies to mental wellness in the workplace and women's equity and empowerment. As a coach, Robin applies cognitive behavioral tactics to help our organizations, teams, and individuals create strategic plans for professional and personal success. Welcome, Dr. Buckley.
Janica, thank you so much. And thank all of you for waking up early and being here. And that is a mouthful that Janica just had to spit out so early in the morning. So let me get to really why we are here today. And it's a quote from one of my clients. So I can't take credit for this. But my client really summarized the work I do in one slightly inappropriate, but very direct way. Our brains are assholes. I'm going to give you an example so you understand where this is coming from. And it's one of my clients named Janet. Just this week, Janet came in for a session with me, and it was the very first time I had seen her visibly upset. So we began analyzing what was going on with her. Now, you might be able to relate to this. Janet had just started a new venture in her startup company, and things are progressing steadily, but not as dramatically as she'd like or as dramatically as she's been used to in her past endeavors. As she was talking, Janet just kept repeating, "I'm just so scared. I'm just so scared," all for the first 20 minutes of our session until I finally asked her what she was scared of. And she told me, "I'm afraid of failing. I'm afraid of not contributing to my family financially. I'm afraid of people not seeing the value in what I'm doing." Have any of you ever had these types of thoughts? I'm guessing you have. Because these are prime examples of when our brains have turned against us. So today, I'm going to give you a very brief neuroscience lesson to understand how to make your brain your ally instead of your adversary. In Janet's words, reduce your brain's tendency to be an asshole. So let's start with the premise that our brains are lazy. Their sole purpose is to keep us alive. Our brains make sure our organs work properly. They process oxygen and nutrients needed to keep our bodies functional. They integrate our thoughts and emotions and behaviors, and this requires a lot of resources. So if something occurs which requires our brains to pull back from its resources, your brain's going to fight back. When you learn new information, your brain fights back. When you try and break a habit, your brain fights back. When you try to do something different than the norm, your brain fights back. And your brain's trying to do its job. It simply wants to stay focused on keeping you alive without disruptions. And there's a specific part of your brain that does this and helps with this goal. And that part of your brain is the amygdala. Okay, enough talking. If you log in on your phones or on your laptop to menti.com, you are welcome to participate with this slide. So you would just type in menti.com and then type in that code. If you don't want to participate, that's okay. You can just shut out your answers. But does anyone know the purpose of the amygdala? What do you know about it? What have you heard about it? No one? No one else is a brain geek like me?
Sorry.
To do with emotions and processing your emotional responses, and it connects to your parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. So it's something.
Janica, you beat me.
And apparently there are brain geeks in the room. I'm glad I'm not the only one. Yeah, you really nailed it. That's terrific. The amygdala is the most primitive part of our brains, and it's often referred to as our reptilian brain because it's existed since our inception as humans. The amygdala's purpose is to keep us safe, and it does so by creating emotions, including fear, anxiety, self-doubt, and uncertainty. So when you have to deliver a speech in front of a large audience, that nervousness you're feeling is coming from the amygdala. Or when you're trying to make an important decision and you're worrying you'll make the wrong decision, That's coming from the amygdala. The amygdala's favorite phrase is "what if," followed by the worst case scenario. When we were back living in caves and hunting for our food, the amygdala kept us safe. It created fear of fire and fear of the dark and other things that were actual life-threatening events. But we don't need much of what the amygdala creates now in terms of those fearful and survival responses. But the brain doesn't know that. So the amygdala just keeps running rampant. Any questions about the amygdala? There is another part of your brain which is significant in our progress and success, and that part is the prefrontal cortex. And the PFC is located right behind our foreheads. Now, anybody know the purpose of the prefrontal cortex?
It's our personality center.
That is true. The personality does have some of its location in the PFC. Nice job.
Is it with like processing information like fear? Like I just remember reading something about teenagers. If they have a lack of fear up until a certain age, it's their prefrontal cortex that hasn't processed or developed enough yet. Is it
Yep,
something?
that's very true. The prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to actually grow and develop. And so for teenagers, when sometimes it seems like they're so together and they've got it all together, and then the next day they are acting like kindergartners, it's because their prefrontal cortex is not fully formed until their mid to late 20s. The prefrontal cortex, as some people are saying, center for emotions, center for processing emotions, exactly. Certainly senses and personality are all processed there. But the most important thing for all of you to remember is that the prefrontal cortex focuses on reality, data, and information. It's strategic, logical, and objective. And when you think about the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, you see that they function from opposing perspectives. Okay, enough of the boring stuff. Here's the part that I find fascinating, and hopefully some of you will as well. There is an interaction between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala that basically cancel each other out. It's kind of like if you were in college and you drank Diet Coke and you ate ice cream, somehow the calories got canceled out. Same thing. When the amygdala is engaged, the prefrontal cortex cannot function. So when we allow the amygdala to do its thing, our rational, strategic, emotion regulating prefrontal cortex isn't working. Our fears, anxiety, self-doubt, and all the other debilitating emotions build and take over because we have not controlled the amygdala. Now, the good news is the opposite is also true. When the prefrontal cortex is engaged, the amygdala cannot function. So let's go back to the example of Janet. When she came into this session, her amygdala was fully engaged. Her sense of fear was almost tangible. She identified the thoughts of failure that were being created from her amygdala. And in order to function effectively, we worked on ways, one of which I'm going to teach you today, for her to engage her prefrontal cortex and quiet that amygdala, because that's where the magic occurs. You can learn actual concrete strategies to engage your prefrontal cortex so you function at your best. Like I said earlier, your prefrontal cortex functions with data, information, and facts, but when the amygdala is frantically spinning, the prefrontal cortex can't focus on reality. So you get to give the data and facts to your prefrontal cortex so it begins to take over. Janet, if you remember, had 3 fears. She was afraid of failing, afraid of not financially contributing, and she was afraid people wouldn't find value in what she was doing. So to control her amygdala, we started with some questions. I asked Janet, have you failed a lot in your life? Of course not. She had not. She's highly driven like all of you. Have you ever not contributed to your family's financial platform? Absolutely not. She began working when she was 13 and never stopped. And then I asked her, what examples do you have that people do find value in what you do? And there were lots of them. Her answers to these questions gave her prefrontal cortex information. And as it processed the information, her brain was able to function in a more effective way. Her cortisol levels lowered, her adrenaline lowered, and she began making more connections between her success from the past and her current situation. And this all occurred by pushing back against the amygdala's fear-based reactions by asking fact-based questions. But we don't tend to do this as humans. We let our amygdalas run around like toddlers on espresso, and it results in lower functioning, negative emotions, delayed progress, or worse, unachieved goals. So this morning, you get to learn some magic, and then you get to choose whether you're going to let your amygdala continue to undermine you, or whether you're going to do the work to get your prefrontal cortex to lead your thinking, to create the emotions and behaviors for your optimal performance. So I promised that we would cover a couple quick strategies that you can put in place right after the session, starting today. And the first strategy I call control the controllables. This strategy, and I will freely admit, these strategies sound way too simplistic. A lot of my clients will say, come on, Robin, like it seems too easy. I'm like, it is easy. The hard part is actually doing them and practicing them. So in this case, we often try and control things that are uncontrollable, things that we are simply not able to control. So can any of you think what things are outside of our control? What things are outside of your control in your life?
The weather, the traffic,
Certainly the weather, yes. What else?
the traffic, other people's reactions.
Other people's emotions.
The economy.
Interest rates.
Yeah, yeah,
Stock market.
yeah. And I actually heard one with a client late last night. He actually lives in Europe, and he's like, oh, none of you have control over what your neighbors are voting in November. I'm like, that is very true, Brian. Thank you for pointing that out. So you summarize a lot of them. They're the man-made things, the natural disaster type of things, and then most importantly, other people's behaviors and choices. You know, if you're a parent or you interact with children, you know that this is an area we try desperately to hold on tightly to and control, but we can't. And that's what makes parenting incredibly challenging, as well as running teams, that we can't control other people, whether it's our kids, whether it's our team members, even when we're trying to help them avoid pain or failure. So we can't control their behaviors and choices, and it's frustrating. So when you think about some of the situations you've been in that have really created irritation, frustration, worry, and anxiety, my theory and what I've seen in my clients is that a lot of those emotions come from the fact that we are trying to hold on to things and control things that we can't. The only thing we can actually control is us, our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviors. Those are the only things that we have 100% control over. Everything else is out of our control. And when we feel out of control, our amygdalas engage to try and protect us. And that's what undermines us in those situations. So to practice this, I want you, if you have something quick to write on, just create a 2-column chart. Real simple. On the left side, you're going to label the column controllables. And on the right side, you're going to label the column uncontrollables. When you think about a situation, maybe it's something that's happened this week or really recently that you were trying to manage, and it was creating these dysfunctional, difficult emotions for you: frustration, irritation, worry, anxiety, self-doubt, any of those. What I'd suggest you do is you create this kind of visual chart, and it really does help if you can do it in writing, because the more we actually put pen to paper by using our hands, our brain processes at multiple points in our brain, so it really understands and understands it at a deeper level. Now, when you think about that situation, I want you to write down all the things that were under your control and all the things that were outside of your control. What most people find is their uncontrollable list is substantially longer than their controllable list, which means you get to focus on the shorter list, the controllable list, and devote all your energy and time to that part of the list. And when you do this, you refocus your prefrontal cortex so that you can function at your best, because your amygdala is now calm. Any questions about this strategy?
None.
Okay. All right. Now, whether you're online or connected to Menti or not, take a look at this. What is your preference? And if you're not connected to Menti, you can just shout it out. Do you prefer to be forced to do something, or do you like having choices?
I would say it depends on the level of stress that I'm under. Sorry.
No, there's no sorries. That's a fair answer. It's a very detailed answer, and I can appreciate it. Anyone else?
Choices.
Yeah. For most human beings, and in most situations, when we are forced or when we perceive that we don't have a choice, we don't feel in control. And as we were talking about, humans don't function in optimal ways when we feel out of control. Very often that type of experience brings up that evolutionary response of fight, flight, or freeze from our amygdala, even around situations when there's no life-threatening situation or variable. Often when we feel cornered, it disrupts our functioning. Our brain tells us we have no choice, and it triggers our survival response, which relates to an increase in our stress hormone cortisol. So this next strategy is about choosing your heart, and I'm going to explain. In situations where we feel like we have no choice, it's because we don't tell ourselves that of course we have a choice. And I have a really great example from a client of mine. Last fall, she was diagnosed with her second bout with breast cancer after being a survivor for 18 years, and she was demoralized. As a former nurse, the double mastectomy that she was facing didn't scare her. It was the 14 months of chemotherapy after the surgery that she didn't want to do. And all her doctors told her that because she had the worst strain of breast cancer, the chemo was going to be horrible. And it was. After each treatment, she was good for about 2 days before the side effects hit and left her debilitated for about 10 to 12 days of the month. So after 6 months of treatment, my client debated stopping the chemotherapy. She told me, Robin, it's just so hard. And I agreed with her. It was. But then I asked her what was harder, the chemotherapy or potentially not killing all the cancer and it coming back. She chose her hard, which was continuing the chemo. There isn't a right or wrong decision when you choose your heart, but when we talk to our brain and give it a choice, it reduces the feeling of being trapped, which then allows our prefrontal cortex to take over and function. So when you're looking at situations in your life, personal or professional, you get to reduce that feeling of being trapped or cornered by reminding your brain, of course I have another choice. It might not be a choice you naturally choose, but just the mere fact of allowing your brain to know there are other choices, it triggers the prefrontal cortex and it quiets the amygdala. And that's your goal, always trying to quiet the amygdala so you can develop strategy, you can problem solve, and your creative thinking can actually kick into place because the prefrontal cortex is engaged. Any questions about this strategy? And I know we're going fast. I want to try and get as many strategies as I could into my 20 minutes.
So I have a quick question. So
Please.
when you're in the zone, right? You're in the middle of your panic attack, you're in the middle of whatever is happening, you're in that situation.
Mhm.
It's easier when I just had my coffee, I just had a lovely 8 hours of sleep, and I'm sitting here theorizing about how to choose my heart, right? But when you're in the moment, and especially if you have anxiety, there's only one path that you see, and it's the bad path, right? Your brain sometimes refuses to give you another option. So, how does a person handle that?
A phenomenal question. So it always starts by what I recommend is managing the anxiety or the intense reaction, whatever it might be first. So it might be imposter syndrome, it might be uncertainty, whatever it is. And so there's lots of other cognitive behavioral strategies that you can use. So certainly if a person has found that breathing exercises help, you start with that. You don't even try and you don't push through and say, no, I've got to choose my heart. No way. Because once you force yourself again to choose your heart, now you're stressing yourself out. And that's where your amygdala is like, nope, we don't want to do that. See, we're creating more anxiety. So if breathing exercises help, you do that. If some type of meditation helps, whether it's guided meditation, traditional meditation, or walking meditation, which I highly recommend, particularly in that situation, because the movement helps a lot, then you do that. If it's going outside and playing with your dog and just getting yourself out of the situation, you do that. If it's walking out of a board meeting because your brain is scrambling because the amygdala is running amok, then you do that. So if a person cannot tap into the specific strategy right away because their emotions are at such a heightened level, then the first step is controlling the emotions. And sometimes it's controlling the emotions by not applying the strategy as your first option. It's getting the emotion, the physical sensation of the emotion under control, so that then you can apply the cognitive strategy and then it can work. Does that help?
Absolutely. Thank you. And yes, I agree with you. Walking meditation is amazing.
Wish more people knew about it. I tell everybody about it. All my clients are now doing walking meditation, and if any of you want to know more about that, you can always reach out to me after the session. Okay.
That was beautifully explained. I just want to add to that.
Say again.
That was beautifully
Oh,
explained.
thank you. Appreciate that. Okay. The last strategy that we have time for today is one that does work really well in controlling the amygdala, as the others do as well. And it's in the form of 180 thinking. Now, this is a version of what I did with my client, Janet. Her amygdala created those fear-based what ifs, and she ended up in a very dysfunctional place, thankfully in our session, so I could help her. So when you think about maybe a situation you've been in recently that created fear or uncertainty, you can relate to where Janet was. Our amygdalas kick in, and we are filled with all types of emotions that inhibit our performance and our strategic thinking. But you get to decide if you're going to choose to provide your brain with a different perspective so that our brains don't sit in that fear. I did this with myself last February because my 19-year-old daughter, who had always traveled with us, but never by herself, she decided she was going to go alone to Amsterdam for a week. And my amygdala started playing all the scenes from that movie Taken with Liam Neeson. What if someone kidnaps her? What if she gets in an accident? What if telecommunications break down across the world and there's no way to contact her? I had a lot of really amygdala-based what ifs. Now, I could have influenced her not to go. I could have tried. I could have also had a week of no sleep while she was gone. But instead, after I did some walking meditation, I actually used my 180 thinking. So while my amygdala is creating all the Taken similar scenarios, my prefrontal cortex said, what if she has an amazing time? What if it's an experience that adds to her personal growth? What if she is completely fine? And she was. Now, this takes practice. Each time your brain tries to return to the original what if, in my case, what if she gets kidnapped? The practice is not to let it settle on it and give it the new 180 what if. Because if you don't, your brain will comfortably settle into the original dysfunctional way of thinking, which lets the amygdala control us, and it doesn't support our optimal level of functioning. So, what was your biggest takeaway you had from our brief conversation this morning? You can either add it to the slide or shout it out, because I love to hear what really impacts you and what's going to be your biggest takeaway to help you move forward after today's session.
Well, I know that the power of the pause struck me very much in your talk. The talk, you have options. I read Andre Agassi's book, Open, and he did a big turnaround in his career when he realized that you can control what you can control. That, and his backhand was his control. But he couldn't control what his competitor was going to do. And so that was very revealing. I think that often, control what you can control.
Yes. And again, if you can write it down, I can't tell you how much more effective it is. Now, if you're in the car, certainly do what you can do and stay safe. So, staying with going through it in your mind. But when you have the ability to write down, the practice is learned faster by your brain, so that over time, your brain automatically goes to, whoop, I can only control these things, and it moves on. But it takes a while to get it to that point. What else?
I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Walking meditation was a good one. Break down the scary. So I love that. Rationalize in both columns. Excellent.
I agree about I completely agree with you, and I really like the fact that being able to break it down, because I'm a very analytical person, right? So when you're in the zone and something is happening and your brain automatically goes to the worst case scenario, right? And you have to walk yourself back and talk yourself back, being able to break it down into realizing that it's a physical response and as well as a cognitive response, right? Because those two are different. And you have to control one before you can control the other. And, for example, for me, I have tried so many different breathing techniques, and I'll be honest with you, I just end up hyperventilating. I don't know what's going on, but and I've tried all of them. So breathing is just not my thing, but walking is, right? And it's really comes down to the person, but I like breaking it down in my mind as physical and cognitive as being two separate entities that need to be handled more or less and dealt with. So I like that.
And I like how you delineated that breathing doesn't work for you, but walking meditation or walking in general does. Because I will work with clients and I'm like, Robin, I'm trying to do the breathing, it's not working. And then it ends up stressing them out. I'm like, if it doesn't work, don't do it. There are plenty of other strategies. When I give my clients homework, I'm like, the first thing I'm going to ask you is, did you do your homework? With no judgment if you didn't. But if you didn't, we're going to break it down. Why? Because if you tell me, Robin, it just didn't work for me, or it didn't feel effective, or it was too overwhelming, then we're going to change the strategy. Because why would you keep beating your head into the wall if it's not producing the result, when it's not producing the result you want? So I love that you were like, yep, breathing doesn't work, but this does work. It's just finding strategies that, when I help clients create a toolbox, it's a toolbox that's specific to them. Not that they are going to use every single one and like all of them and they're equally effective. It's what works for you. And then let's focus on those.
I agree. Yeah, I've tried sitting meditation too, and I just end up falling asleep, and then I wake up like half an hour later. I'm like, did I get anything? Did I get anything accomplished in my mind? But when I'm walking, all the thoughts just come right out and boom, done. And your breathing normalizes. I mean, how much better can you get?
Absolutely. Other takeaways or questions that I can help you with?
I liked when you spoke about choice is hard, because I think there are other options for us, but we don't always think about them. And it was good to know that you can stop that panic by just thinking about it differently. But
It's not that that story for my client, although heartbreaking, it really clearly shows, because most of us are trying to find the right answer and the best option. And sometimes the best option is just that. It's the best. It's not perfect, but it's the best one we have from all of the options or choices that are out there. And it's just reminding your brain, no, it doesn't have to be this one thing. You get to look at all the options and then decide which one is the one you're going to move forward with. Also knowing that if it doesn't work out, you can go back to some of the others. So I agree. I think that's so important, and one that I think many of us forget about. It's like, oh, I have to do this, which is another strategy that we couldn't get to, but just the words we use can really create changes, physical changes in our brain, which of course relates to physical changes in our thinking and then our emotions and behaviors. So poor Janica, when she first reached out to me to do this talk, I was like, so I looked up your session and like, you meet for an hour and a half. I can totally do that. She's like, no, you have 20 minutes. I'm like, okay, we will condense it. So there's lots of great stuff out there, and I'm happy to answer questions offline if need be.
Oh my goodness, I feel like we have an opportunity. Maybe we could do something really special next year with you being an hour and a half long session presenting to us. I feel like I just got so much from that, and I love that because I'm taking a program certification right now, which is actually very similar with some of the topics that you've touched on today. Did anyone have any questions for Dr. Buckley before we let her go today? Any more feedback or questions from the group here? I think we're all processing.
I can imagine. Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah.
You can use the QR code that you see on the screen to, I always really value input from and feedback from people, but there's also the value. If you use that term values, there's an exercise that I can walk you through to help you really identify some of your core values, which I think a lot of people say, oh, I know my core values, but when you actually do it in a structured way, sometimes it's really revealing what you can find out about yourself. So thank you again for having me. I really enjoyed it. And Janica, I always look for an opportunity to come to New England. So if you ever want to do an in-person thing,
Well then, okay, you all heard it here.